Hello, and welcome to the final episode of this Introduction to the Racing Rules series from the RYA. This episode, delivered by John Napier, builds on the rules around the marks, which we introduced with Chris Atkins in episode 4. John is currently a rules consultant for World Sailing and is one of 2 international technical delegates responsible for overseeing and ensuring the fairness of the sailing competition at the Tokyo Olympics. He is one of the foremost international judges and umpires who regularly officiates at the highest level and is chair of the RYA's Judges and Umpires Committee, as well as being a member of the RYA Racing Rules Committee. As always, if you're watching this live, then please put any questions you may have in the live chat on the right-hand side of your screen, where John and I will be available to answer them. If you're watching this later, then please put any questions in the comments box below, and we will try to answer this when we can. So I'll now hand over to John for this session.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Marks Part 2. As Neil said, this is the last week in the current series. We hope you've been enjoying it so far. Week 4 was Part 1 with Chris Atkins. He covered the basics of mark rounding, so Rule 18 about the marks and Rule 21 about exoneration. We're going to summarise those in this session, but if you haven't watched those yet, you might want to pause this session, watch Chris's session, and then you can always come back and have a look at the slightly more complicated rules we're going to look at here. So as I said, we're going to recap and summarize very briefly the concepts from week 4. We're going to consolidate our learning to date. We're then going to be looking at tacking in the zone. That's Rule 18.3. We'll be looking at when that applies and when it doesn't apply, and at the concept of fetching the mark and that definition. We're going to be looking at when mark room includes room for tack. So when do you get extra space around the mark to put in a tack? And we're also going to look at briefly when things go wrong. So what happens when overlaps are broken whilst we're in the zone, when people barge in? What happens if a door or a gap is left open for you? Can you sail through it? And what do we do in cases of doubt about overlaps? Have we overlapped in time or have we not overlapped in time? So let's recap briefly the main definition and the rules about marks. What do we mean about mark room? Well, it's a defined term. It's in italics, so we know that means in the rule book it has a special definition. Mark room is based on the wider definition of room. So what we're going to do now is just remind ourselves of what room means. So I'm going to show you the definition of room with some blanks in it. So just take 30 seconds to work out what are the key parts of the definition of room that you need to think about. So the space a boat needs in something, including space to comply with something while maneuvering blank in a something way. So just take 30 seconds to remind yourselves of what the basic definition of room is. Well, the first part of it is the space a boat needs in the existing conditions. So this means we take each situation into account. The winds, the sea state, the tide, all of these will be different in different scenarios. And so the room, the space you need is different in each scenario. So the space you need in 20 knots in a heavy sea, tide against wind on a Solent, that's going to be more space than you need than 6 knots on a flat lake with no current. The second part of it is that it's also the space you need to comply with your obligations to keep clear, give room to others, and to not touch the mark. That's the reference to Rule 31. So the room you have to give to others includes the room that they in turn may have to give to other people. So remember, if you're in a large group of boats, a large number of boats rounding a mark, as Chris said in week 4, the outer boats will have to give a lot of room to allow all those other boats to give room to each other and comply with their obligations. So best to avoid that scenario if at all possible. And finally, it's only the space needed to move in a prompt and seaman-like way. So if you're the boat which is entitled to room or mark room here, bear in mind that you must act in a prompt way. You cannot delay, nor do the rules take into account other factors such as having an inexperienced crew. You must act promptly. And secondly, it's the space you need to act in a seaman-like way. So if you have to give room to somebody else, it has to be enough room to perform seaman-like maneuvers. If you only allow them enough space for someone to crash tack or crash jibe, for example, that's not seamanlike, and so you won't have given them enough space. So that was the concept of room. Let's apply that to what happened at the mark. As Chris said in week 4, there are a number of parts of the definition of mark room. How much space do we get to go around a mark? Well, first of all, it's the room to leave the mark on the required side for rounding or passing, depending on the type of the mark. Also, it's the room to sail to the mark when your proper course is to sail close to it. So it's only room to go towards the mark if your proper course would be go to it. We know proper course is a defined term. What does that mean? Well, you would have learned probably last week with a mark that it's the course a boat would sail to finish as soon as possible in the absence of all the other boats in the situation. And secondly, you get room to round the mark as necessary to round it. So it's not the space that you would prefer. It's not the space to make a proper course rounding. It's only the amount of space you need as is necessary to round the mark. And then finally, as Chris mentioned in week 4, but we're going to look at today in a lot more detail, mark room can also include even more space to let you tack around the mark as well. But that's only in certain defined circumstances. You can see the text on the screen, and we're going to look at that in a lot more detail later on, so I'm not going to dwell on it now. So now a quick reminder about the 2 key basic rules in Rule 18 that Chris talked to you about. So first of all, we're going to look at 18.2b, that's the zone rule. It says that if you're overlapped outside or you're clear astern when the first boat reaches the zone, then you have to give a mark room thereafter for the rest of the rounding of the mark. So hopefully that's the rule you're all familiar with. If you're not sure what we're talking about, go back and have a look at Chris's section. If that rule doesn't apply, and there might be a number of cases where it doesn't, then 18.2a is really a fallback rule. It says if 18.2b, that's the rule on the left-hand side of the slide, if it doesn't apply, then if you're overlapped, the outside boat has to give the inside boat mark room. So hopefully common sense, what you're expecting, but those are the 2 key basic rules that apply in mark roundings. Now remember that the rules also operate between pairs of boats. If you have 3 boats in a scenario, if you're going around a mark with boats A, B, and C, then you have to think about the relationship between A and B, A and C, and B and C. So they all might be slightly different, and you have to think about you as opposed to all the other boats that are going around the mark.
So John, you referred to these rules as being applying between pairs of boats, but what would happen, say, if I was the inside boat at a mark and there were 3 or 4 boats outside me all coming into this mark, and it was the outside boat that wasn't giving enough room, which was causing the issue? Who would I protest in that instance? Would I have to protest each boat in turn, or what would happen there?
Neil, no, you don't need to protest all the boats in the scenario. You can, if there was a chain of 4 boats and it was the outermost boat which was at fault for not giving everybody else enough mark room, then you can just protest the outside boat. Now, you can just make it between the 2 of you. You might actually choose to protest the other 2 boats in between as well, because it might be that they broke a rule as well. It might be that the protest committee, when it's hearing the case between the 2 of you, decides actually one of the other boats broke the rule, and the protest committee is going to protest them. That might delay the entire proceedings. But whether you choose just to protest the outer boat or everybody, you're going to need witnesses. If it's a 4-boat mark rounding, it's obviously going to be very probably a complicated situation. So it would be advisable to line up the other boats as witnesses so that they can give as much information as possible to the protest hearing. But no, you don't need to protest everybody if you don't want to. You just protest the boat that you think is at fault, and hopefully the protest committee will resolve it. We also talked in part 1 about exoneration, the concept of the corridor. So here we have a slide from Chris's session about rounding a mark. Remember, if you're sailing within your mark room corridor, then you'll be exonerated if you break other rules, such as port starboard, rule 10, windward leeward, rule 11, or if you changed course without giving the other boat room, that's rule 16. So remember that as long as you're within the corridor of mark room, then you'll be exonerated for other rule breaches. We also said earlier that the definition of room included space to comply with the rules. So bear in mind, particularly if you're an outer boat in a scenario, the amount of room you have to give may be even more because other boats need to give others room. So here we have yellow, blue and green. Yellow is the boat entitled to mark room as against blue, and green has to give mark room to both yellow and blue. Green has to give enough corridor of room for both yellow and blue. So bear in mind, the corridor may be even bigger for the outside boats. And then finally, remember that Rule 18, which is about marks, and Rule 21 about exoneration, these are bolt-ons to the existing rules. They operate in conjunction with them. So unless they interfere with the rules, they continue to apply. So all the other rules we've learned about in this series, that's Rule 10, port starboard, Rule 11, windward leeward, Rule 12, clear ahead, clear astern, the tacking rule, Rule 13, 15, which is about acquiring the right of way when you either keep clear boat and you go to being the right of way boat, 16 about changing course, and 17 about proper course. These all continue to apply. It's just that mark room and exoneration may protect you from breaking them at a mark. So that's the recap of the what we've seen already. Now let's look at tacking in the zone around a rounding mark. Well, first of all, what's the problem? Well, as we all know from experience, windward mark roundings can be slightly chaotic. If you're on a larger fleet, such as lasers or optimists, for example, boats will have chosen different sides of the beat, and with a classic port hand mark rounding, where we're leaving the mark on our left or port hand side, those who went left on the course were now becoming up towards the mark on port tack. Now, if you're sailing upwind to a windward mark and you're on port, even if you reach the zone inside a boat on starboard, so you think you're overlapped with them, you're not overlapped within the meaning of the rules. That's because Rule 18, that's 18.1, expressly says this rule does not apply to boats on different tacks when you're going upwind to a beat to windward. So what does that mean? Well, we have boats arriving at the mark on different tacks. The boats on starboard will be right of way against those who are on port. The port boats who are tacking onto starboard to get round the mark, they're going to have to keep clear until they're established on starboard. And once both boats in starboard, then the boat clear astern is going to have to keep clear of a boat clear ahead. That's Rule 12. So let's look at an example of this. So this animation shows just 3 boats. Remember, we're in a large fleet. We may have 30, 40, 50 boats all approaching in a similar situation. We've got yellow and green, they're on starboard, right of way under Rule 10. We've got blue, she's the port boat, she's going to have to keep clear of yellow and green. And for the moment, let's ignore that there's going to be a tacking in the zone rule. Let's have a look at the situation and just take a few seconds to decide if what blue does here is okay under the rules. Okay, well, blue keeps clear of yellow, so that's all okay. We have blue crossing behind. Then we have blue crossing green and managing to tack onto starboard before green has to take any avoiding action, so that's okay. We then have blue becoming established on starboard, so becoming right of way on green. She has to give green room to keep clear, and green can do that. She can luff. She does luff to avoid blue. And then she has to keep clear of blue as the boat clear astern. Green never overlaps inside blue, so we don't have Rule 18 applying. So if we don't have a specific mark rounding rule to deal with this scenario, actually there's no problem under the rules. But is that what we want? Well, no, not really. When boats converge, the risk of collision increases. As we all know, to our wallet's detriments, boats aren't cheap things. Marks bring boats together, especially on the first lap of a course when they're more concentrated. The boats are more likely to come together. We have port tack boats who need to find a gap. Now, they're not going to want to bear away too many places and lose out. The size of the gap will be variable depending on who you are. If you're a port tack boat, you're going to tell the protest committee that the gap was massive and you could have sailed a cruise liner in between it. If you're a starboard tack boat, you're going to say it was no more than a metre or two. And obviously bearing away, if you're the port tack boat, will increase your speed and therefore increases the momentum that's taken into any collision. Now, the boats approaching on starboard, they're usually in a line, they're all setting up for the mark, and that makes it very hard for them to see any port tack approaching boats. So even if there is a gap which the port tack boat thinks is big enough, the starboard tack boats aren't going to see them very easily. So all that adds up to a dangerous combination, and for the rules, we need to have a rule that discourages this. The solution is Rule 18.3. Now, it applies between two boats. If it applies between two boats, then it's important to note that this rule overrides the other two that we've already looked at. So 18.2b, the zone rule, and 18.2a, the basic overlap rule, they don't apply if this rule applies instead. Now, it has a number of parts. Let's break them down. The first part is it says, if a boat in the zone of a mark to be left to port. Now, this is key. This changed in the current edition of the rulebook. So up until 2016, this will have applied at any windward mark rounding. It now only applies at port hand mark roundings. So here we have two different types of mark roundings. We have yellow going round, leaving the mark to starboard, and we have blue leaving the mark to port. Now, it will only apply in the right-hand situation here to the blue boat. It doesn't apply to the yellow one. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, as we said, the purpose of the rule is to enable an orderly rounding of port hand windward marks, which are far more common in racing, and we do that by limiting the rights of the boats that approach on port. Secondly, in the yellow scenario here, actually the basic right-of-way rules, the ones that don't work for us so well in the scenario on the right, they operate very differently. So as we'll see later when we look at a scenario, we don't actually need Rule 18.3 for a starboard hand mark rounding. So we're at a port hand mark rounding. What's the next part? Well, if the boat in the zone of a mark to be left to port passes head to wind from port to starboard tack and is then fetching the mark. So we've got to be fetching the mark, and what does that mean? Well, it's in italics, so we know that there's a definition of that. In our R-Way rulebooks, we can find that at the front in the blue pages. And the definition is that you're fetching a mark when you're in a position to pass to windward of it and leave it on the required side without changing tack. So here's some examples. Here we have 4 boats at a port hand rounding mark, winds coming from the top of the page. Take 30 seconds and decide which of these boats is fetching the mark. Well, first of all, let's look at yellow. Is yellow fetching the mark? No, she has to tack to get around the mark on the required side. She's coming up on port. Clearly, she's not fetching. Next, let's look at red. Is red fetching? Well, clearly, yes. She's actually overstood. She doesn't need to tack again, and she can pass to windward of the mark without tacking. Let's look at blue. Is blue fetching? Well, she's on starboard, but she's not going to pass it on the required side at the moment. She's going to need to tack again. So blue is not fetching the mark. And fourthly, green. Is green fetching? Well, it depends. She may or she may not. If there was a strong current coming from the northeast, say, of this picture, then she might not do it. If there was no current, or the current was coming from behind her and she had a good breeze, then she might be able to eke around without passing head to wind. So as always, it depends on the facts at the time, but if you're going to apply Rule 18.3, then after the tack, you need to be in a position to fetch the mark. So back to the rule, we're at a port hand rounding mark. We've had to tack from port to starboard, and we're now fetching the mark. So what does that mean? Well, there's going to be 2 obligations on us now. First of all, we cannot cause another boat who was on starboard since entering the zone to luff above close hold to avoid us. That's after we've tacked. And secondly, if that boat does then become overlapped inside us, then we have to give them mark room as well. So the boats that have been approaching on starboard, once you've completed your tack onto starboard yourself, you can't cause those ones behind you to have to luff above close hold to avoid you, even if the normal rules say that they should have done that. And secondly, if they do happen to overlap inside you, then you need to give them mark room. So let's apply that rule to the same situation that we saw earlier, see if it's made a difference. So again, here's rule 18.3. This is the same diagram we saw earlier. Just take a few seconds to have a look at it and see if that's made a difference to the situation. Well, first of all, it's a mark to be left to port. When blue tacks from port to starboard, she's fetching the mark. She doesn't have to tack again to get around it, so that's okay. We've had green sailing on starboard since entering the zone. So the key question then is, does green have to luff to avoid contact with blue? Now, you might have different views on this, but if you decide yes, green did have to luff to avoid blue, then blue has broken rule 18.3. If no, green was just luffing because she thought she wasn't going to get around the mark, and actually it was nothing to do with blue, then no rule was broken. And as we said in the second part of the rule, if green ended up overlapped inside blue, then green is going to be entitled to mark room coming around the mark. So that's the summary of tacking in the zone. 3 tests to apply. First of all, is it a mark to be left to port? If yes, it is, then on to the second one. Are you approaching from port to tack onto starboard? If yes, will you be fetching the mark after your tack? If yes, then the 3 conditions are met, and then you can't cause boats on starboard to luff to avoid you. And if they sail between you and the mark, you're going to have to give them mark room. Now, we said all through that this applies at a port hand mark. As I mentioned earlier, what's the situation at a starboard hand rounding mark? Well, rule 18.3 that we've just looked at doesn't apply. The normal rules cover almost all the situation. And as we said earlier, rule 18 sits on top of the normal rules and only interferes with them as necessary. So let's say we have the reverse situation. We have a number of boats, 30 boats lining up on the port lay line to round a mark to starboard, and we have one boat approaching that line of boats on starboard tack. How do the rules apply? Well, the boat approaching on starboard is the right-of-way boat. All the other boats are going to have to keep clear of her. A boat tacking from starboard to port is going to have to keep clear whilst tacking. And once she's finished tacking, the normal rules will apply. A boat clear astern will have to keep clear of a boat clear ahead, or the boats that are overlapped to windward are going to have to keep clear. And if there's going to be any overlap, then the basic rule will apply 18.2a, because we weren't overlapped at the zone. We can't make a zone judgment, but the basic rule will apply. The inside boats must be given mark room. So here's the scenario. Have a look and see if you think any rule has been broken. Take 30 seconds, but remember to bear in mind not just the mark rounding rules, but also the basic right-of-way rules that we've been looking at all throughout this series. So let's have a look. Well, in classic fashion, it depends. The first thing you have to do is, did green keep clear of blue? It's a port starboard situation. The mark doesn't make a difference here. If you think that green didn't keep clear and that blue was tacking to avoid, so if blue was tacking to avoid green, then green hasn't kept clear as the port boat and be disqualified for breaking rule 10. But if you think that blue was actually tacking to go around the mark, let's go to the second phase of it. did blue keep clear while tacking? So from the moment blue passes head to wind, she's the tacking boat. And from that time, she has to keep clear of green. If you think blue didn't keep clear of green, then she's broken rule 13 and she'd be disqualified. But if we got past that and you think that blue did keep clear whilst tacking, then the normal rules will continue to apply. There's no need to have an additional mark rounding rule like a rule 18.3 in this scenario, because the boats approaching on port are already at risk because they're the keep clear boats. So that's rule 18.3. You can see how it works on a port hand mark rounding, and now why we don't need it at a starboard hand mark rounding. Now let's have a look at when mark room includes room for you to tack around the mark. So earlier, when we looked at the definition, we saw this section of text at the end. Mark room for a boat does not include room to tack unless she's overlapped inside and to windward of the boat required to give mark room, and she will be fetching the mark after her tack. This is about increasing the space that you're allowed even more to potentially include space to tack around the mark for the required side and for you to do that tack in a prompt and seaman-like way. So there's 4 key parts to think about here. Now, first of all, you have to be the boat entitled to mark room. This is part of the definition of mark room. So if you want to even begin thinking about whether or not we have room to tack, then you need to be entitled to mark room in the first place. But if we do, the second bit to think about is you need to be the inside overlapped boat. So it's all very well having mark room, but to have room to tack around the mark, you're going to be overlapped inside at the time that you need to tack around the mark as well. The third bit, you need to be to windward as well. So we need to be the inside overlapped windward boat in order to consider this. And the fourth part, as we've just been looking at earlier, we need to be fetching the mark afterwards. So you only get room to tack around the mark once you've been in a position to fetch the mark after the tack. So let's have a look at 3 examples now about how this works. Here we have 2 boats approaching a port hand rounding mark, wind from the top of the page. And the question here is yellow allowed room to tack around the mark? So take 30 seconds and decide, based on what you've just seen, is yellow going to get room to tack around the mark? So let's have a look. Well, first of all, we said you have to be entitled to mark room in the first place. And yellow is. She was overlapped inside at the zone. You can see at position 2, the overlap line coming out to the port side of blue. And so 18.2b tells us that when you're overlapped at the zone, you're entitled to mark room. Is yellow overlapped inside and to windward? Well, yes, she is. And would she be fetching the mark after the tack? Yes, she is as well. So in this scenario, yellow's mark room includes more space to allow her to tack in a prompt and seaman-like way around the mark. Let's have a look at another example. Similar type of situation, wind from the top of the page. Is yellow entitled to room to tack in this situation? Take 30 seconds to have a look. Well, first of all, you have to be entitled to mark room. And yellow is, same as before, she was overlapped inside when we reached the zone, so she's going to be entitled to mark room. Is she overlapped inside at the time she needs room to tack? Well, no, she's not. In this situation, it's different. At the time that she needs the room to tack, you can see that she's actually clear astern. You can see the overlap is broken whilst inside the zone. So it's important to note that the concept of room to tack, when you're allowed space to go around the mark, is at the time you need that room. It's not based on the situation at the zone. Now also, you'd even have to think about Was she going to be fetching after the tack? We don't know that, obviously. So in this situation, blue has to give mark room to yellow, but she doesn't have to give her extra space to tack at the mark. Now, tactically, you might think that this is a bit unfair. If you're the overlapped inside boat and you're entitled to mark room, what use is it if you can't actually use it to get around the mark? Well, that takes us to our third scenario. Have a look at this and think about your normal basic right-of-way rules. Does yellow have to let blue tack around the mark? So have a quick think about that. So does yellow have to let blue go around the mark? Well, the answer to that is no. So let's break the situation down. We have yellow, which is a windward boat, and blue, a leeward boat. So yellow has to keep clear of blue. Now, mark room is an entitlement. Yellow is going to get mark room, but it's only an entitlement for yellow. It's protection for her. It's not an obligation on yellow to use it. So if blue wants to try and pass the mark, she's going to have to tack. And once she tacks, when she passes head to wind, she's going to become the keep clear boat under Rule 13. And even once she's tacked onto starboard and finished tacking, she's going to have to give yellow room to keep clear under Rule 15. We looked at that earlier in the course. Blue has gone from being a tacking boat to being a starboard boat and with the right of way. So she's going to have to give yellow enough space to keep clear of her. Now, if blue can do all of that, then she's going to be far enough ahead that she should be allowed to round the mark. But if she's not in a position to do that, and that's probably the case here, then yellow can push it on past the mark until yellow herself is in a position to tack around the mark. So although the definition of mark room here doesn't include room to tack around the mark, the normal rules will allow yellow to push blue past the mark and to allow yellow to get a good rounding. So onto our final section, 3 shorter things to look at. First of all, what happens when you lose your hold or your mortal enemy tries to barge in at the windward mark? Now, this is dealt with under Rule 18.2c. The first thing to think about is the zone rule has to apply. So when we reach the zone, when the first of the boats reach the zone, one of us has to be overlapped or clear ahead, clear astern. Now, if you're the boat that's required to give mark room, so you are astern of the other boat when you reach the zone, you must continue to give that mark room even if the overlap then breaks or a new overlap begins. So even if the boat was overlapped inside you and now the overlap is broken, you still have to give the mark room. So if you've overtaken her, for example, within the zone, you're still going to have to give mark room. Or if you entered the zone and you were clear astern, so you originally had to give mark room because you were astern, and then you speed up and manage to get an overlap inside, you're still going to have to give the other boat mark room. And if you do overlap inside, then there's a further consequence. The mark room, as we looked at earlier, is the room for someone to get around the mark as is necessary for them. Now, if you barge in, that room enlarges to become their proper course room. So not only are they then allowed the room, the space needed to sail around the mark as necessary, it's actually then the space they would sail for their proper course. So how they would choose to sail in the absence of all other boats. So 18.2c is there to discourage and to penalise boats who then try to barge in. Now, what about barging at a start mark? That's the most common place that barging commonly happens. Does this rule apply there? Well, no, because you should remember from the other sections that Rule 18 doesn't apply to start mark when it's surrounded by navigable water from the time they're approaching to start. That's the Section C preamble. So at a starting mark, we're back to the basic rules. The second part, what if the boats ahead of you are so involved in their own issue that they leave a beautiful gap for you to sail into? So here we have green being clear astern of yellow and blue when we reach the zone. So green has to give mark room to yellow and blue. But when the gap opens up, can green sail through it? Well, the answer is yes, but it's entirely at green's own risk. This is from a world sailing case. When the mark When at a mark, the space is made available to a boat that's not entitled to it, she may, at her own risk, take advantage of the space. So if yellow and blue returned to the mark to round it as is necessary for them, and green was caught sneaking through, then green would not have given them mark room and would be disqualified. So if the door is open for you, then you can sneak through and take it, but it's entirely at your own risk. You need to be confident that you can accomplish the maneuver correctly. And finally, I want to talk a bit about resolving doubt. If you've had a look at Rule 18, you're eventually going to get to a rule called 18.2e, and it says if there's reasonable doubt that a boat obtained or broke an overlap in time, it shall be presumed that she did not. Now, you might think that this helps you in the water if there's reasonable doubt that your mortal enemy has managed to sneak an inside overlap at the zone, then you can refuse to give a mark room, surely. Well, sadly, that's not the case. This is a rule which is there to tell protest committees what to do in a protest when they can't decide what the facts are and what to do. So to explain this briefly, I'd like to show you an RWA case to briefly explain the rule, not only to explain the rule, but also because it shows how cases can help your understanding with different explanations of different scenarios and are a great learning tool. So back we go to 2002. I can tell you Queen Elizabeth has just celebrated her Golden Jubilee. The euro has just become an official currency, and at Pembrokeshire Sailing Club, disaster has occurred. Two boats, Nutmeg and Spindrift. Now, Nutmeg in this case believed she had an inside overlap when the zone was entered. She thought that she sailed fast enough to get an overlap. Now, Spindrift in turn hailed back no water. And Spindrift felt that because she'd done that, she'd caused Nutmeg to have a reasonable doubt that she'd obtained an overlap in time. And so Nutmeg should have pulled out of challenging for the room and could have avoided the collision. So Spindrift essentially is trying to say no water and make it was so confusing that Nutmeg should have really bailed out. Now, what did the RWA say in its wisdom? Well, this is an RWA case, so the protest committee made a decision and that was appealed to the RWA, and the RWA issued this decision. First of all, the RWA said, well, disagreements of this nature are commonplace. It's incredibly common for boats to shout no water at each other or overlap each other at the zone. 18.2e, the reasonable doubt rule, does not change the situation on the water. You're either overlapped at the zone or you're not overlapped at the zone. It's a binary choice. You can't be half pregnant, so to speak. And if it comes to a protest hearing, Spindrift, the boat that protested in this case, has to prove her case and say there's no overlap. And Nutmeg would have to prove her case and say that there was an overlap. So the rule is there as an aid to protest committees when the evidence given by the parties is inconclusive and you have to decide which way to go. So don't read relating to E and think that, well, on the water, if there's reasonable doubt, I know that it goes one way or the other. That's not the case. It's there to help protest committees to decide cases. Now, you may think that's not very helpful to you on the water. What do you do? Well, I can tell you there is a rule, which, in my opinion, tells you what to do when you're in doubt, and that's Rule 14. Rule 14, which we looked at earlier in the series, says a boat shall avoid contact with another boat if reasonably possible. And you'll note that this rule is unique. It doesn't say anything about who has the right of way. It doesn't say anything about a boat having to keep clear. It doesn't say anything about a boat being entitled to room. And it doesn't say anything about being entitled to mark room. It is a rule that's addressed to all boats in a scenario. So unlike all the other rules where it says one boat has right of way over another, this rule imposes an obligation on all boats to avoid contact if reasonably possible to do so. Now, I've not replicated the rule in full. It does go on to say that you can be exonerated from breaking it in certain circumstances, or that it's when it's going to be reasonable for you to take avoiding action. But the important principle remains that contact must be avoided if at all possible in all scenarios. It is much better to avoid contact and protest rather than collide and hope that you're right in the protest. So that's the end of my talk. Just a final slide. If you love the rules so much, where can you learn more? Well, as we said, there's the RWA casebook and the World Sailing casebook. They have literally hundreds of examples of different cases, different rules, broken down by rule number for you to help and understand them more. There's the RWA Racing Rule Advisory Service. That's for GBR individuals, protest committees, clubs, classes to get help with the interpretation of the rules from the RWA. If you're from another country and you're watching this series, then you should contact your own M&A. And finally, if you find yourself interested in the rules, then why not consider volunteering as a judge or umpire? We have lots of information on our website. It's a great way to see the sport close hand and give something back whilst indulging your newfound love of the rules. So I'll leave you all there. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series of RWA Racing Rule Talks. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That now concludes our first series of an introduction to the racing rules. The RWA are currently planning a second series, and I hope to be able to announce this shortly, so please keep your eyes out for any announcements on this. If you have any feedback on this series or what you'd like to see in any future series, then please do get in touch with us. Similarly, if you're now keen to see what race officiating opportunities there may be, as John said, then please do get in touch with us via raceofficials@rya.org.uk. So now all that remains for me to do is to thank John and all our other presenters for their contributions to this series, and indeed to all of you who've tuned in every week. We hope you've found it useful and look forward to seeing you back out in the racecourse soon. Goodbye.